Hello there, this is Neil Feit from SUNY Fredonia. I'm going to talk today for a while about a philosophical perspective on ethics known as consequentialism and a particular version known as utilitarianism. So we're going to be thinking here about the normative ethics of behavior. So it's pretty clear that some of the things we do are morally wrong, while other things that we do are morally right. And we're sometimes going to use the word permissible for morally right actions. You might often be faced with choices where you can do several things, and two or more of them are going to be right. That just means there's nothing wrong with them. They're morally permissible. And we're talking here about morality and not the law. So we're not talking about legally permissible actions. We're talking about morally permissible, or on the flip side, morally wrong actions. So what makes an action have one of these statuses or the other? So a moral status might be something like right or wrong, morally right, morally wrong. According to consequentialism, the moral status of an action is determined only by its consequences. And we're going to contrast this next time by other perspectives according to which things besides consequences roughly matter. Okay. So according to consequentialism, right actions have the best overall consequences. And this stems from a pretty compelling intuition that morality requires us to do the best that we can. And in our reading, if you're watching this as a Phil 258 student, Philosophy 258, in the reading that goes along with our topic this week, we see the author describe consequentialism like this. The consequences of an action are all that matter in moral assessment. What should we do according to consequentialism? Consequentialists typically argue that we're obligated to do whatever action has the best overall consequences for all who are affected by the action. In other words, not just you who performs the action. That would be known as ethical egoism, that you're obligated to do what's best for you, but for all who are affected by your action or one of its alternatives. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit, describe the view, and ultimately get to some objections and possible responses. Suppose you are walking by a shallow pond and you see a child drowning in the pond. You think of two alternatives that are open to you. Okay? Well, we could tie this in with our free will debate. In some sense, you have two alternatives open to you. You could keep on walking, or you could save the child. Okay? So here in the lower left, I have the two alternatives. It seems quite clear that rescuing the child is going to have better consequences. Simply walking away is going to have worse consequences. So consequentialism is going to imply here that it's morally right for you to rescue the child, morally wrong for you to walk away. That's the idea. Okay, consequences are simply the outcomes of the actions that we perform. Most of the time, our actions are going to have good or bad effects on some people. It's probable that most of our actions probably affect some people in positive ways, others in negative ways, right? Again, you count your well-being as a result of doing something helps to determine whether you're acting rightly or wrongly, but so do others. Other people count as well. So consequentialists have us think about the value of a consequence, how good or bad it is, and that's a matter of how much well-being there is in it. So in the drowning child case, which I just showed you, the agent is going to be our fancy word for just the person who does the action. They have at least two alternatives. In some cases, we're going to have more than two alternatives. There might be three or four things that we're capable of doing, but in every case, the right action is going to be the one that results in the most well-being as compared with its alternatives. And in a moment, we're going to call that maximizing well-being. By the way, consequentialists want us to think not just of short-term consequences, what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 minutes, but long-term consequences, in principle, indefinitely far into the future. Okay, so here I showed you this statement, we're obligated to do what has the best overall consequences, right? Well, here's the here's the theory. An action is morally right if it maximizes well-being, otherwise it's wrong. Basically, that word obligated, you're obligated to do something provided that all of your other alternatives are wrong. Okay, so in some sense it's the only right action. What does it mean to maximize well-being? Well, an action maximizes well-being when no alternative to it that you could perform would produce more, even more well-being. So an action maximizes well-being when, in a nutshell, it has at least as good consequences as any other action that you could do instead. And here are just some abstract situations, right? Here on the left side is just an abstract situation where you have two possible actions, A1 and A2, and A1 results in 20 units of well-being, right? A2 results in 17 units of well-being. Well, here A1 maximizes well-being. A2 doesn't. So A2 is morally wrong according to consequentialism because you could have done something better. Here on the right-hand side is an abstract situation where you have three possible actions that you might perform, A1, 2, and 3. Here A1 is wrong because you could do better. That action doesn't maximize well-being because there are alternatives that would produce more. Okay. Here A2 and A3 both maximize well-being, so they're tied for the best. No other action besides A2 or A3 produces more than 35 units of well-being. So consequentialism would say doing A2 is right, doing A3 is right. Take your pick. Okay. I hope you remember hedonism. So what I've just been talking about, consequentialism, it's a theory of the right actions. Right actions are those which maximize the good. Hedonism is a theory of the good or well-being. Remember hedonism? Pleasure is intrinsically good, pain is intrinsically bad, nothing else is intrinsically good or bad. So when it comes to well-being, many consequentialists, including important ones in the history of philosophy, have also been hedonists. They've accepted some version of hedonism, and you might remember John Stuart Mill, whom we talked about. So if you take consequentialism and you add hedonism to it, you get a version of consequentialism that's known as utilitarianism. Some of you might have heard that term before. Okay. If you do the reading, you see another dead white guy, another English philosopher. But utilitarianism is associated with two very influential English philosophers in the 18th and the 19th century, Jeremy Bentham on the left, and his student John Stuart Mill on the right. And when we talked about hedonism, we talked a little bit about John Stuart Mill's so-called qualified hedonism. Mill wrote a short book called Utilitarianism, and here's a very famous quotation from that book. "The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure." There's a lot of interpretation that we could do to kind of extract a kind of consequentialism out of there, but that's the standard way in which this passage is interpreted, partly due to other remarks that Mill makes in this book or series of chapters, Utilitarianism. So I'm showing you here a moral theory known as utilitarianism, and according to this theory, an action is morally right if it maximizes pleasure. Otherwise, it's morally wrong. So you want to do the right thing? Do the action that's going to, in some sense, make the most people happy compared with everything that you can do in that situation. Okay. Basically, utilitarianism comes from taking well-being in consequentialism and just plugging in pleasure, right? So an action maximizes pleasure when no alternative that you could do in the situation would produce even more pleasure. Okay. In the rest of this video, and I might make you come back to this final exam type of thing. We're going to focus on utilitarianism in particular, but almost every issue that I'm going to talk about in the next how many minutes of this video is going to affect consequentialism more generally, as well as utilitarianism, this specific version which incorporates hedonism as a theory of the good. Okay, there's no doubt that a lot of our moral thinking is utilitarian or consequentialist in general. You think about that drowning child case, almost everybody would say, yes, you have a moral obligation to save the drowning child, because that's just a much better thing to do. If you do that, there's going to be two people who get to live instead of just you, and the child is likely going to, the saving of the child is likely going to make the child's family very happy. It's going to be a lot more pleasure in its consequence than if you walk away and don't save the child. Okay. However, I think pretty much everyone thinks that consequences are in some way relevant to the morality of an action. However, consequentialism and utilitarianism, they say that that's the only morally relevant consideration, right? That's all that matters. So I'm going to turn to some objections to utilitarianism, and I'm going to talk about kind of three big ones. And I don't mean to imply that these are the only ones. So a lot of people find utilitarianism to be too demanding. Some people say it sets too high a standard for humanity. So utilitarianism implies that we often act wrongly. We often do the wrong thing when we spend money on ourselves, etc. Okay, and here's just one example. Suppose that I have $1,000 and I'm thinking of two things that I might do with it. Okay, so I might donate the money to Oxfam. Okay, if you don't know, Oxfam is a very effective, very good, highly reputable charity that provides famine relief, feeding people who are in great need, preventing suffering. Okay, or I could buy a new phone. I could buy myself a new phone. Okay, well, this is very important. A chart like this is the way to think if you want to think about applying utilitarianism or consequentialism to the morality of an action. Which one of these actions is going to maximize well-being or pleasure in particular? Well, it seems quite clear that giving $1,000 to Oxfam is going to maximize pleasure, right? That's going to help several people in need. Whereas if I buy a new iPhone, pretty much I'm the only one who's going to maybe be a little bit happier, and I'm already really happy, so how much happier can I get? Okay, so that's the idea here. Utilitarianism implies that my buying a phone is wrong, or whenever we spend money on luxuries or entertainment, according to this objection, utilitarianism implies that that's almost always wrong. But intuitively, the objection is assuming here that there's nothing wrong with me spending my own money on a new iPhone for myself. Okay, hopefully that's clear. Why is that value of the consequence of giving $1,000 to Oxfam $450 as opposed to only $150 for buying a phone? Well, I mean, here's the idea. Okay, so the idea here is there's about 150 units of well-being in this situation. Whoops. Okay, so there's me. I'm living high. I could afford a new iPhone. And here are some other people. Maybe I don't know where they are. Maybe they're in Sudan or Syria, wherever. And they have a really low level of well-being. I'm kind of letting them suffer and die. Okay, whereas if I give the money to charity, okay, there's going to be 450 units of well-being here. I'm just a little bit lower, right? I'm dealing with my old phone, which is not so bad, but these people here are each of them, 3 other people, let's say, are much happier, much more pleased than they were without my charitable donation. Okay, of course my money is not going to help everyone, but there are some real people whom I can help by giving $1,000 to a really good famine relief organization. So that's the idea. Okay, I might make you find this argument sometime. I don't know. final exam or something like that, we could formulate this objection to utilitarianism in terms of an argument against it. So if utilitarianism is true, we very often act wrongly when we spend money on luxuries, entertainment, etc. And I will refer you back to that chart. If utilitarianism is true, then if I buy myself an iPhone when I could have donated that money to charity, which would have resulted in even more pleasure, I'm acting wrongly if I'm spending money on myself, right, the iPhone. But according to premise 2, it's not the case that we very often act wrong. Premise 2 is sort of an intuitive judgment, okay? In philosophy, we have to test theories against our intuitions. Most people have a pretty clear intuition that when you do something for yourself or for your friends, buy yourself a new pair of shoes, a new pair of pants, go to the movies with some popcorn and drinks, that's not wrong. It's not a morally wrong action. Okay, so this is a valid modus tollens argument against utilitarianism. There are some ways in which utilitarians can respond to this. Okay, take a look at premise 2. Premise 2 says it's not the case that we often act wrongly when we perform these actions. So premise 2 is basically saying, no, we do the right thing. We do the right thing when we're spending money on ourselves. Well, utilitarians could say that that's false. They might say that these sorts of actions really are morally wrong because we could be doing better. But there is a difference between evaluating your action as a wrong action, on the one hand, and evaluating you as a bad person or a blameworthy person, on the other hand. So utilitarians can claim that these actions are wrong, but that doesn't imply that we ought to say that the people who perform them are blameworthy or bad people. Okay, I leave it to you to think about if this is a good objection. On the other hand, if we have a lot of people who are always doing the wrong thing, why should we say that they're, good people, right? Okay, premise 1 might also be challenged. Premise 1 basically says that utilitarianism implies that it's often wrong to spend money on new phones and new clothes and stuff like that. Somebody might claim that the utility of donating to charity maybe isn't really higher than the pleasure resulting from donating to charity really isn't higher than buying oneself an iPhone. After all, if you don't buy that iPhone, there's maybe going to be people who work in the Apple factory who might lose their jobs, delivery people, blah, blah, blah. So there are very complex and interesting issues in philosophy and economics here. But still, at premise 1, it does seem hard to deny with respect to a lot of situations. It seems like we could do a lot more good in the world by foregoing certain luxuries and shifting the money, or our volunteer time for that matter, to charitable deeds. Okay, so I leave it to you to think about that. There's an important strain of objection to utilitarianism that involves promises and related things like that sort of look back into the past. So utilitarianism looks to the future, right? Future consequences of our actions. But common sense morality also looks to the past to see if we've made any promises, or maybe if people have done nice things for us, you might think we're obligated to repay the kindness and stuff like that. According to utilitarianism, the only moral reason that we have to do anything is it's going to maximize pleasure, right? So we should keep a promise only if this maximizes pleasure. So only if keeping the promise would result in at least as much pleasure as not keeping it. And that would be our only moral reason to keep the premise. But critics argue that there's other moral reasons to keep promises, namely the very fact that we made those promises to begin with. Okay, I'm going to go kind of fast here, but you could always pause and think. There was an English philosopher much later than John Stuart Mill, mostly in the 20th century, named W.D. Ross, Sir William David Ross. And he defended a pluralist theory of morality. He thinks that consequences are important, but there's lots of other things that are important as well. And in my next video, I'm going to kind of refer back to his more positive perspective. But today I want to talk about a critical argument against utilitarianism. Okay, here's where you might want to pause and think, but I'm going to read this quotation. This is from a 1930 book that Ross wrote called The Right and the Good. Suppose that the fulfillment of a promise to A here is a person. so you made a promise to A, would produce 1,000 units of good for him. 1,000 hedons, right? But that by doing some other act, I could produce 1,001 units of good for person B, to whom I have made no promise. The other consequences of the two acts being of equal value. Should we really think that it was our duty to do the second act and not the first? I think not, Ross writes. We should, I fancy, hold that only a much greater disparity of value between the total consequence would justify us in failing to discharge our prima facie duty to A. What Ross is saying here is, if you make a promise, you should keep it, unless you could do a whole lot better, right, by breaking it. And he says, after all, a promise is a promise, and is not to be treated so lightly as the theory we are examining, which happens to be utilitarianism, would imply. Okay, so, a lot of words. He's a fancy writer, but I hope the idea there is pretty clear. So let's call this Ross's promise argument. You could always find it here in these slides, if I ever ask you to look back and find Ross's promise argument. So, again, this is going to be another modus tollens argument against utilitarianism. If utilitarianism is true, then every keeping of a promise that fails to maximize pleasure is wrong. And that premise is undeniable. If utilitarianism is true, then every action that fails to maximize pleasure is wrong, whether it's a keeping of a promise or some other kind of action. And I will explain this premise with a chart in a moment. But according to Ross, not every keeping of a promise that fails to maximize pleasure is wrong. In Ross's case, the keeping of a promise to person A, fulfilling that promise, right? It fails to maximize utility, or it fails to maximize pleasure because 1,001 is greater than 1,000. But he thinks you should keep that promise to person A. So if utilitarianism is true, every promise keeping that doesn't maximize pleasure is wrong, but not every promise keeping that doesn't maximize pleasure is wrong. So utilitarianism is not true. Okay. If you look at that chart in the bottom, okay, keeping the promise benefits person A to the tune of 1,000 and has no effect on B. So its well-being or its pleasure value for its consequence is 1,000. Breaking the promise doesn't benefit A, but it does benefit B to the tune of 1,001 units of good or pleasure. So so which action maximizes pleasure here or well-being? It's the breaking of a promise. So if utilitarianism is true, then keeping the promise is wrong here, because there's another option, breaking it, which maximizes pleasure. Okay, but Ross thinks that in this case it's morally right to keep your promise and it's morally wrong to break it. Just because maybe you promise to help person A move and person B has a little bit more stuff, so you could do a little bit better good in the world by helping person B. But if A is the one you promise, you should help person A. Okay. By the way, the reading has a fun, well, I don't know, fun in a morbid kind of way. Similar example here. Suppose your friend on her deathbed makes you promise to spread her ashes in the Rocky Mountains. After her death, you realize it would be much more convenient to simply flush her ashes down the toilet. You'd save a lot of time and money, and no one would be harmed. Since this act appears to have no bad consequences, consequentialism entails that would be nothing wrong with this, but most of us think there would be. Most of us think you should keep your promise, even if breaking it is not going to result in even more pleasure. Okay, so long story short, Ross thinks that there's another reason that you should take into account when you're deciding what to do. The reason is, have I promised to do one thing over another? Okay, I'm going to finish up with another objection, which is an important objection to utilitarianism and also the more general consequentialism. So here's a nutshell preview of it. Utilitarianism implies that certain actions are right, they're morally right, but intuitively, so utilitarianism implies that they're right, but intuitively they're wrong, since they're unjust, or we might say unfair, or they violate people's rights. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to consider this other example from, this is the Consequentialism article that I'm going here from the 1,000 Word Philosophy Anthology. Okay, so here's another example. This is in the author's section, Problems for Consequentialism. So, 5 A-list celebrities need transplant organs, or they will soon die. No viable organs have been found so far, but while reviewing your medical records for a routine physical, doctors notice that your organs are perfect matches. A plan is hatched to kill you in secret, making it look like an accident, to save the celebrities. This is thought to be an overall better consequence than your living and the 5 celebrities dying, and their millions of fans devastated. It's hard to see how a consequentialist could explain how this is wrong, and yet we tend to think this would be profoundly wrong for the doctors to kill you without your consent and harvest your organs to save the 5 A-list celebrities. Okay, so I hope everyone gets the facts of that example. Okay, let's call this the A-list celebrities argument. Okay, if utilitarianism is true, the doctor's action of killing you is right. But the doctor's killing you is not right, and hence utilitarianism is not true. Okay, if you asked me, hey Neil, would you explain premise 2? Describe the reason why premise 2 is supposed to be true. I would say something like this. You have a right to life. The doctors would be violating that if they killed you, even though they could benefit 5 other people with your organs. The doctors would be harming you significantly. Remember we talked about Epicurus, right? The doctors would be depriving you of the rest of your life. You have not consented to this. So they'd be violating your rights. It would be extremely unfair and unjust to you to inflict this harm upon you, right? Just so people could be benefited when you didn't agree to this or didn't consent to it in any way. That's premise 2. What about premise 1? Well, premise 1 seems correct. Here's a little chart. Again, very, very important with these if-then premises. We're connecting, we're kind of asking why the truth of utilitarianism implies the doctor's killing you is right. Okay? Well, we have to see which act maximizes pleasure, right? Killing you is going to prevent you from living the rest of your life, but it's going to save those 5 celebrities. They're going to go on with the rest of and I'm not even, by the way, the exact numbers here don't make much of a difference. It's more like the comparison that's more important. But in any case, that 500 is the pleasure that those A-list celebrities are going to experience in the rest of their lives and all their fans, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Whereas, if the doctors don't kill you, those 5 celebrities will not be around. They're not going to get to experience any more pleasure. Their fans maybe will be distressed for a while. And 100, that's just you. You will get to go on with your life. Okay, so it seems like if we're just thinking about consequences here, right? 5 happy people alive is much better than just 1 happy person alive. And forget about all the fans and all that stuff. According to consequentialism and utilitarianism, all the fans really do matter also. Okay. So I hope the objection is clear here. By the way, here's another example which you're gonna read about in the next reading on deontology, Kantian ethics. So I won't spend much time on this at all right now. But there's there's 5 people here, like down here in the lower right. They're innocent people, but they're tied up on a sort of a trolley track, and there's a trolley heading toward them. There's no way to stop it. Maybe the driver had a heart attack or something. And here's you're up here, and there's this giant man, right, this large fellow, okay? And, you might think this is unrealistic, but bear with me, just accept this for the sake of the argument. You could push him off, and the trolley will kill him, but his body is so giant that it's going to stop it and save the 5 people. So should you push the one person, sacrifice him to save the lives of those 5 people? Well, utilitarianism seems to say that it would be right for you to push the man and wrong for you not to. So again, this seems to conflict with most people's very clear moral intuitions about the morality of pushing the giant man in this case. Okay, is there any way a utilitarian could respond to this objection? Well, I made a little chart when I was explaining that A-list celebrities argument with the doctor's alternatives, and along with the pleasure levels. In other words, the pleasure levels from the alternative of killing you versus the alternative of letting you live. Okay. Utilitarians might think, well, is this really realistic, right? Aren't the doctors going to get caught? Aren't the doctors going to go to jail? Are your organs really going to be a match? So, there is sort of an aura of, irrealism about these examples, which might make us question their applicability or their, adequacy as far as testing a theory goes. Okay, so, if the consequences of killing you for the doctor's case are not really going to be that much better, or better, if we can't be sure, than letting you die, then premise 1 of the A-list celebrities argument might be false. The idea, the objection, the utilitarian objection here is that there are so many other confounding factors involving the doctors might get caught or experience severe regret, blah, 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 that we shouldn't think that it's going to be much better if they kill you. On the other hand, utilitarianism is supposed to be a theory that applies to any conceivable action, and it does seem we could imagine cases where the numbers might come out as they are described here, right? Okay, just 1 minute and I'll be done. Some people think that we could move to a theory that they call rule utilitarianism, and it's kind of an interesting thing. I'm going to make this optional. So rule utilitarianism basically says that an action is morally right if it conforms to a rule whose widespread adoption would maximize pleasure. So the idea here is, killing you in this particular case maximizes pleasure because of what can be done with your organs. But the rule, killing an innocent person, is not a rule that would maximize pleasure. So according to rule utilitarianism, it would be wrong if the doctors killed you. Okay. So rule utilitarianism is kind of an attractive theory. On the other hand, like any philosophical theory, it has problems too. Here's just one. Rule utilitarianism would seem to permit, as morally acceptable, morally permissible, the exploitation of a minority group by a majority group if this is going to bring about the most pleasure. A rule that says that the majority could exploit the minority, if the widespread adoption of that would maximize pleasure, because hey, the majority is the majority, right? That rule utilitarianism seems to imply that this exploitative, maybe even very cruel behavior is morally right, because that's gonna be the rule. Exploit the minority is the rule whose adoption would maximize pleasure. Okay, next time we are going to talk about another perspective on ethics, and these two perspectives, consequentialism today, deontological ethics is going to be called next time, are going to kind of leapfrog us into sort of one or two issues in applied ethics, especially the morality of abortion, that we're going to finish up with if you're in my class this semester.